The autumn of 1943 was a season shrouded in the shadow of death for the U.S. 8th Air Force stationed in England. In the cold morning mist of East Anglia, the deafening roar of the B-17 Flying Fortress engines could not drown out the despair in the hearts of their crews. At that time, if you were a waist gunner on a bomber, your life expectancy was measured in mission counts, and that number was usually in the single digits. The skies of Europe were the hunting grounds of the Luftwaffe. Under the command of General Adolf Galland, the German fighter wings were at the zenith of their operational capability. Flying Bf-10-9s and FW-19s, they tore into Allied bomber formations like packs of wolves. The core of the problem lay in one fatal flaw: range. At the time, the Allies' best fighters, whether the American P-47 Thunderbolt or the British Spitfire, were tethered by their fuel capacity. They could only escort the bombers to the German border, near Aachen or Antwerp. Upon reaching that invisible line, with fuel gauges dropping, the escorts had to turn back. That moment was the cruelest of all for the crews of the B-17 and B-24s. They watched helplessly as the friendly fighters with white recognition stripes dipped their wings in farewell and vanished into the western horizon. Almost immediately, the radio would crackle with alarms. German fighters inbound. The Germans knew this perfectly well. They didn't even bother wasting ammunition over the English Channel. They simply circled east of the escort turnback point, patiently waiting for the Allied bombers to arrive, like lambs to the slaughter. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions of August and October 1943 became bloody footnotes to this tactical dilemma. In these battles against German bearing factories, the U.S. Army Air Forces, USAAF, suffered devastating blows. On Black Thursday, October 14th alone, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s, with another 138 severely damaged, and over 600 airmen killed or captured. Even the resolute commander of the USAAF, General Hap Arnold, had to face a brutal reality. If the problem of long-range escort could not be solved, the strategic bombing of Germany could not sustain itself. Without air superiority, there was no hope for the Normandy landings. Without escorts, the Allied air offensive would shatter against the German flak and fighter screen. The Allies desperately needed a miracle, and that miracle was lying quietly on the drafting tables of North American Aviation and Rolls-Royce, awaiting a historic fusion. Turning points in history often stem from a chance conversation. The P-51 Mustang was not originally designed for the USAAF, but to fulfill a British order. The early A-model Mustang possessed an aerodynamically brilliant airframe, utilizing a revolutionary laminar flow wing that drastically reduced air resistance, but its Allison V1710 engine limited its potential. The engine performed well at low altitudes, but once above 15,000 feet, its performance plummeted. In an era where air combat often raged above 25,000 feet, the early Mustang was relegated to reconnaissance or ground attack roles. However, after testing the aircraft, British test pilot Ronnie Harker proposed a bold idea. What if we put a Merlin engine in this? It was the greatest heart transplant in aviation history. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 60 series, equipped with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, was an engineering masterpiece of the time. It was what kept the Spitfire powerful at high altitudes. When the Packard Motor Car Company in the U.S. secured the license to mass-produce this engine as the V1650 and stuffed it into the Mustang's streamlined fuselage, a brand-new war machine was born, the P-51B. This was no longer just a fighter, it was a blade honed for vengeance. Test flight data dropped jaws everywhere. With the Merlin engine, the Mustang's top speed broke 440 miles per hour, approx. 708 kilometers per hour, and its service ceiling reached 41,000 feet, 12,500 meters. It could easily outrun any German fighter at high altitude. But what made strategists tremble was its range. Thanks to the low drag of the laminar flow wing and the efficiency of the Merlin engine, combined with internal fuel tanks and disposable drop tanks under the wings, the P-51B had a combat radius exceeding 600 miles, with later models surpassing 1,000 miles. What did this mean? It meant it could not only fly to Berlin, but fight there and then fly back. The Berlin Express was ready. In November 1943, the 354th Fighter Group arrived at Boxted, England. They were known as the Pioneer Mustang Group because they were the first combat unit equipped with the P-51B. The news caused a sensation within the 8th Air Force. The legendary commander of the 4th Fighter Group, Colonel Don "the Horse" Blakesley, couldn't wait to visit the 354th to fly this new bird. Blakesley was a warrior to his core, sick of the frustration of turning his P-47 Thunderbolts back at the German border. When he landed the Mustang and hopped out of the cockpit, he famously told General Arnold, "This airplane can go to Berlin. If you don't give them to me, I'll take them away with a stick." However, having a superior aircraft was not enough. It required the right doctrine. In January 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. The legendary hero who had led the raid on Tokyo brought his profound and ruthless understanding of war to England. Before his arrival, the tactical dogma for escort fighters was close escort. Fighters were to act like sheepdogs, sticking tight to the bomber formation, strictly forbidden from leaving the bombers to pursue enemy planes. The German pilots exploited this. They would dive on the bombers, attack, and then pull up to escape, knowing the American escorts could only watch them flee, bound by orders. On his first day in the command room, Doolittle saw a famous sign on the wall. "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to protect the bombers." Doolittle frowned and ordered his adjutant, "Take that down." It was replaced by a new, lethal command. "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy the German Air Force." This was a fundamental strategic shift. Doolittle unchained the Mustang. From now on, the P-51 was no longer a passive shield, but an active spear. They were authorized to conduct fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber stream, breaking up German formations as they assembled, and even chasing enemy planes down to the treetops to destroy them over their own airfields. A new kind of terror began to spread among Luftwaffe pilots. They found that whether at high altitude, fleeing at low level, or even on the runway at home, those silver Mustangs were inescapable shadows. If one needs an example to epitomize the performance of the P-51 and the courage of Allied pilots, the Oschersleben raid of January 11, 1944, serves as the perfect testament. On that day, the Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group were escorting bombers deep into Germany. It was a brutal mission, targeting FW-190 production plants. Major James Howard, commander of the 356th Fighter Squadron, was cruising above the clouds in his P-51B, nicknamed Ding Hao, Chinese for very good. Howard was no novice. Before joining the USAAF, he had been a member of the Flying Tigers in China, tangling with Zeros in the Pacific Theater. His cool, precise killer instinct had been forged under the Asian sun. As the formation approached the target area, the Germans launched a ferocious counterattack. Approximately 30 twin-engine heavy fighters, Bf-110s and Ju-88s, covered by single-engine Bf-109s, attempted to tear apart the formation of the 401st Bomb Group. In the chaos, Howard became separated from his squadron. Convention dictated that a lone plane deep in enemy territory should seek friendly cover or return home. But Howard made a decision that shocked everyone. He pulled back on the stick and charged, alone, into the swarm of German planes. At that moment, at 20,000 feet, a one-man show unfolded that even Hollywood would hesitate to script. Howard first latched onto a twin-engine Bf-110, preparing to fire rockets at the bombers. Utilizing the Mustang's superior dive speed, he slashed in behind the enemy, his 4.50 caliber machine guns spitting fire, instantly turning the German plane into a fireball. But that was just the beginning. For the next 30 minutes, Howard single-handedly weaved through the German formation. Using the Mustang's unmatched climb rate and turning ability, he disrupted the German attack lines time and time again. The bomber crews watched, stunned, through their plexiglass windows, a solitary P-51, like a furious falcon, diving into a flock of vultures. When a Bf-109 tried to engage him, he executed a violent high-G barrel roll, forcing the enemy to overshoot, and then shot him down. Even when 3 of his 4 guns jammed or overheated, he did not retreat. He continued to dive at enemy planes, using the glint of his wings and propeller to intimidate the German pilots. Confused by this ubiquitous Mustang, the Germans believed they were facing an entire escort squadron. They broke formation and abandoned their attack on the bombers. In that long half-hour, Howard fought off more than 30 enemy aircraft alone. He was confirmed to have shot down 3, later gun camera analysis suggested as many as 6, damaged several others, and successfully protected the flank of the 401st Bomb Group. When Howard landed back at base, his tanks were dry, his ammo exhausted. He calmly filled out his combat report as if he had just completed a routine flight. It wasn't until days later, when the reports from the bomber crews were collated, that command realized what had happened. The bomber group commander wrote in his report, "It was a case of one lone American against what seemed to be the entire Luftwaffe. He was a one-man air force." For this heroic action, James Howard became the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the Medal of Honor. His actions proved 2 things. First, Allied pilots possessed wills of steel, and second, the P-51 Mustang gave that will the material foundation to perform miracles. In the early months of 1944, as more P-51Bs, and soon the P-51D with its improved bubble canopy, arrived in England, the tide began to turn. The 4th Fighter Group finally got their wish and transitioned to Mustangs. Colonel Don Blakesley not only kept his promise but laid down a rule. If you run out of fuel pursuing the enemy, that is glory. If you come back with full guns and half a tank of gas, you'll be court-martialed. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief Hermann Göring began to feel uneasy. In his Berlin residence, he read reports from the front that increasingly mentioned an American fighter with square wingtips, fast as the Grim Reaper. Initially, German intelligence dismissed these fighters as strays that had lost their way, but with every raid, the Mustangs appeared closer and closer to Berlin. German pilots found that their old tactics of hit and run, or assembling outside American escort range, were obsolete, whether over Hanover, Brunswick, or Magdeburg. When they tried to climb and attack the lumbering B-17s, the silhouette of the P-51 would suddenly appear overhead. The roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine became the death knell for the Nazi Luftwaffe. This was not just a victory of technology, but of industrial capability. American assembly lines were running at full speed, shipping thousands of Mustangs across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the German industrial heartland faced an imminent, devastating blow, codenamed Big Week. It was late February 1944. The Allies planned a series of concentrated bombings against the German aircraft manufacturing industry. This would be the week the P-51 Mustang took center stage in history and the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's backbone. But before the storm arrived, at freezing bases across England, ground crews were painting new recognition colors on the silver warbirds. The noses were painted in bright hues, red, yellow, blue, and white checkers. It was a provocation and a statement of confidence. They no longer needed camouflage. They wanted the Germans to see them clearly. The hunters had arrived. On February 19th, 1944, the foul weather that had plagued the continent for weeks finally cleared. Meteorologists handed Allied High Command a report that would determine the fate of the air war. For the next week, the German heartland would experience rare, clear skies. At headquarters in England, a plan codenamed Operation Argument was placed on the table. History, however, remembers it simply as Big Week. This was not merely a bombing mission. It was a massive, carefully designed trap. General Karl Spaatz and General Doolittle had reached a cold consensus to completely destroy the Luftwaffe before the upcoming Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings. They had to force the Germans to fly and fight. How to force them? By striking where it hurt most, the aircraft factories. The Allies assembled over 3,000 heavy bombers and thousands of fighters. This vast armada would drive straight for Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Leipzig, names that were synonymous with the production lines of Messerschmitt and Junkers. For the P-51 Mustang pilots, Big Week was their true coming-of-age battle. Before this, while the P-51B had shown potential, numbers were limited. Now, with production lines roaring, Mustang squadrons were flooding the order of battle. On the morning of February 20th, the roar of engines shook the entirety of southern England. In the briefing room of the 354th Fighter Group, the commander pointed to the red line on the map slicing deep into Germany and spoke calmly. "Gentlemen, our mission today is not to escort bombers to a place and come home. Today's mission is a hunt. The bombers are the bait. You are the butchers." It was a brutal tactic. The crews of the B-17 and B-24s would act as magnets, drawing the Luftwaffe up through the flak and into the air. Once the German fighters appeared, the P-51 Mustangs, cruising high above, would descend like thunderbolts, utilizing their altitude advantage. General Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, immediately realized the danger. Radar screens lit up with a swarm of blips indicating the Allies were out in full force. He ordered every available day fighter wing to scramble. That week, the sky turned into an inferno of steel and fire. Over Leipzig, an air battle of unprecedented scale erupted. German FW-190 pilots, accustomed to attacking sluggish bombers, attempted to use Sturmbach, battering ram tactics. Heavily armored FW-190s approaching from the rear, covered by light Bf-109. But this time, they miscalculated. When the Bf-109s tried to engage the Allied top cover, they were shocked to find the P-51 Mustangs not only outclimbing them, but outnumbering them. Utilizing the superior high-altitude performance of the Merlin engine, the Mustangs dominated the Bf-109Gs at 30,000 feet. Once the high cover was scattered, the FW-19Os below became sitting ducks. Mustang pilots pushed their sticks forward, screaming down into the German formations. In high-speed dives, the advantage of the laminar flow wing was absolute. The airframe remained rock steady, the gun sight stable even as they approached the speed of sound. In that single week, the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of fighters. More critically, they lost the veterans, pilots who had survived the Spanish Civil War and the Battle of Britain. Planes could be built, but aces capable of surviving complex high-altitude dogfights could not be mass-produced. By the end of Big Week, the German aircraft industry was battered, but that was superficial. The true strategic victory was that the spine of the Luftwaffe had been snapped. They were forced to pull instructors and novices to the front to replace losses, leading to a fatal spiral in combat effectiveness. The P-51 Mustang was the key force behind this devastation. It proved that it could not only fly the distance, but was the undisputed king of the dogfight. If Big Week broke the Luftwaffe's back, what followed pierced the Nazi heart. Berlin. For Allied pilots, the name held a dark magic. For Hitler, it was an inviolable fortress. For Hermann Göring, it was his vanity. Early in the war, he had boasted, "If a single enemy plane flies over Berlin, my name is not Göring. You can call me Meyer." Previously, only RAF Mosquitoes had harassed Berlin at night, or Lancaster fleets had area bombed under the cover of darkness. But to fly a formation of hundreds of heavy bombers over the Reich capital in broad daylight? That was considered suicide. The distance was too great, a round trip of over 1,100 miles. No Allied fighter could escort them the whole way until the P-51. On March 3, 1944, Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group stood before a massive map of Europe. His eyes were sharp as a hawk's as he looked over his young pilots. "Some people ask me, how far can we fly?" Blakesley's voice was raspy and powerful as he slapped a black dot on the map. "We are going to Berlin." Dead silence fell over the room, followed by a low rumble of excitement. "We are going to Berlin," Blakesley repeated, louder this time. "And we are going to bring the bombers back unharmed. I don't want to see a single Mustang turn back early because he's afraid of dying. If you want to stay in this group, you're coming to Berlin with me." The March 3rd mission was fragmented by bad weather. Most bombers turned back. Only a few squadrons of P-38s and P-58s managed to ghost their way to the edge of Berlin, but no effective strike was made. But that was just the rehearsal. The real storm broke on March 4th. March 4th, 1944. The cold air reeked of high-octane fuel. The 8th Air Force launched Mission 248. Target: Berlin. The P-51Bs of the 4th Fighter Group were fully loaded, massive drop tanks hanging beneath their wings. That day, ground crews painted the noses of the 4th Group bright red. It wasn't for aesthetics, it was for identification, to let every German in the sky know the fiercest pack was here. Takeoff, formation, climb. As altitude increased, temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Frost covered the canopies. Heating systems barely kept the pilots from freezing. During the hours-long flight, pilots battled not only the cold, but the hypnotic vibration of the engine. They had to stay alert, constantly weaving to check blind spots, monitoring fuel gauges, adjusting mixture. As the Armada crossed Hanover, the German air defense network awoke, radios filled with the static of German commands and shouts. On the ground, 88mm flak cannons punched black clouds into the sky, paving a road to hell. But this time, as the bombers approached the outskirts of Berlin, the German pilots, accustomed to harvesting unescorted bombers in this sector, saw a sight that chilled their souls. Above the B-17 formations, the silver specks did not turn back as usual. Instead, they jettisoned their drop tanks and, like a swarm of angry hornets, accelerated toward them. It was the P-51 Mustangs. They were really here. At 28,000 feet, an epic melee unfolded. Colonel Blakesley led the charge. Flying his Mustang, he latched onto a Bf-109, attempting to attack the lead bomber. The German pilot tried to escape by climbing steeply, a tactic effective against the heavier P-47s and P-38s. But he watched in horror as the red-nosed American plane in his mirror climbed right with him, closing the distance. The twin-stage supercharger of the Merlin screamed, gifting the Mustang incredible energy in the thin air. Blakesley held the pip of his optical sight steady on the enemy. A short burst, .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds shredded the Messerschmitt's wings. This was but one moment among countless others. That day, the skies over Berlin became the Mustang's stage. They displayed amazing versatility. High up, they used speed and turning performance to hunt fighters. At medium and low altitudes, they used superior dive acceleration to run down fleeing FW-190s. A young pilot named Chuck Yeager, who would later become the first man to break the sound barrier, was in the formation that day. For a natural genius like Yeager, the P-51 was an extension of his body. He later recalled, "That airplane did what you wanted it to do. When you saw Berlin burning under your wing, and you had the stick of the best fighter in the world in your hand, you felt invincible." Despite the Luftwaffe throwing massive numbers of fighters into the interception, they could not breach the iron wall of the Mustangs. That day, the first American bombs fell on Berlin soil. Berlin, the Reich Air Ministry. Hermann Göring, the once arrogant Reich Marshal, stood before a massive window, staring at the gray sky. Air raid sirens wailed mournfully across the city. In the distance, flashes of flak sparkled in the clouds. An aide, trembling, handed him a report. "Herr Reichsmarschall, forward observation posts confirm. The enemy bomber stream is accompanied by single-engine fighter escorts." "Impossible!" Göring roared, the fat on his face trembling. "Those are Spitfires. They can't fly this far. Those are P-47s. They don't have the fuel." "Sir," the aide's voice was as low as a mosquito. "Based on wreckage identification and pilot sightings, they are North American P-51 Mustangs." Göring fell silent. He grabbed his binoculars and looked to the sky. Through a break in the clouds, he saw them. Silver flashes, darting like minnows through the air, rolling freely over Berlin, chasing his pride and joy, the Bf-19s. In that moment, a chill ran up Göring's spine. He was not ignorant of aviation technology. As a World War I ace, he knew exactly what this meant. If Allied single-engine fighters could escort bombers all the way to Berlin in broad daylight, then the Luftwaffe had no safe harbor left. The entirety of Germany, every inch of ground, was exposed to Allied fire. The so-called defense of the Reich collapsed in that instant. According to post-war interrogation records, Göring later admitted, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." It was not just the failure of a single raid, it was the total collapse of a psychological defense line. The appearance of the Mustang declared that Nazi Germany had lost control of the sky. And in modern warfare, without air superiority, there is only one outcome: destruction. If flying to Berlin took courage, flying back was a gamble of endurance, and the execution ground for General Doolittle's coldest order. On the return leg, many P-51s still had ammunition. Under old rules, they would conserve fuel and head home. But the new order was, destroy anything that moves. This was the famous strafing tactic, or more vividly, the turkey shoot. As Mustang squadrons passed over Luftwaffe airfields, they abandoned high cover and screamed down to treetop level. It was an extremely dangerous mission. The ground bristled with 20mm and 37mm flak, forming a web of death. The P-51's liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable. One hit to the cooling system, and the engine would seize within minutes. But it dealt a devastating blow to the Germans. Many German planes had just landed, refueling and rearming, completely defenseless. Mustangs turned runways into seas of fire with their 6.50 caliber machine guns, standard on the new P-51D. The pilots of the 4th Fighter Group were particularly aggressive. Don Blakesley encouraged his men to attack locomotives, truck convoys, even barracks. On the road home, countless German aces died not in dogfights, but on their own runways. This destroyed not only aircraft, but the morale of the ground crews. They realized there was no safety anywhere, sky or ground. Meanwhile, these ultra-long-range raids tested the American pilots to their physiological and psychological limits. Sitting in a cramped cockpit for 7 or 8 hours, enduring high-G maneuvers, freezing cold, the risk of hypoxia, and nerves stretched to the breaking point. Many pilots, upon landing, had to be lifted out of their cockpits by ground crews because their legs were too stiff to walk. But when they looked at the gun camera footage and watched the survival rates of the bomber crews climb, they knew it was worth it. By May 1944, as the P-51D, the ultimate model with the iconic bubble canopy and perfect visibility, entered mass service, the situation was completely one-sided. The P-51D solved the visibility issues and gun jamming problems of the BC models, becoming the perfect killing machine. The Luftwaffe was forced into a defensive crouch, their sorties becoming fewer and fewer. Across the Channel, millions of Allied soldiers were gathering. The countdown to Normandy had begun. General Eisenhower looked at the reports on air superiority and smiled with satisfaction. He knew that when his soldiers stormed the beaches, there would be no screaming Stukas overhead, only Allied fighters with black and white invasion stripes, standing guard. And all of this was owed to the Mustangs that flew across the Channel, penetrated deep into enemy territory, and beat the Luftwaffe until it dared not raise its head. On the night of June 5, 1944, every Allied airbase in southern England was gripped by a tense, strange flurry of activity. It wasn't air raid sirens, but the smell of paint. Ground crews, buckets in hand, wielded large brushes meant for painting barracks, hastily applying black and white stripes to the wings and fuselages of every aircraft. 3 white stripes, 2 black, each about 18 inches wide. These were the famous invasion stripes. For the pilots of the 3, 5, 4, and 4 fighter groups, these stripes were more than identification markings. They were a promise from General Eisenhower to the hundreds of thousands of Army brothers hitting the beaches. When you look up, if you see a plane, it will be ours. It was an audacious promise, but on the morning of June 6, 1944, it became reality. When Operation Overlord commenced, and thousands of Allied soldiers struggled for survival on Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Gold, and Sword beaches, they looked up in fear, only to be pleasantly surprised. There were no screaming Stukas, no strafing FW-190s. There were only P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts patrolling the clouds like guardian angels. By now, the P-51D was the absolute workhorse. The bubble canopy gave pilots 360-degree visibility, allowing them to dominate the airspace. On D-Day and the days that followed, Mustang fighters wove an impenetrable net over the invasion. Where was the Luftwaffe? In fact, the Luftwaffe tried to counterattack. Wing Commander Josef Pips Priller of JG-26 did manage to take off, but he could only tragically lead his wingman in a single, symbolic strafing run over the beaches. The vast majority of German fighters were intercepted by roving P-51s before they could even get close to Normandy. Doolittle's free hunt tactic was bearing fruit. Mustangs were no longer confined to the beaches. They roamed deep into the French interior, severing the aerial corridors the Luftwaffe needed to support the front. For P-51 pilots, it was a moment of glory, but also frustration. They couldn't find enemies in the sky. The Luftwaffe had been beaten into hiding, so the Mustang's mission shifted. This thoroughbred racehorse, born for high-altitude escort, was forced to strap on bombs and rockets to do the grunt work, ground support. Although the liquid-cooled P-51 was more vulnerable to ground fire than the rugged P-47, its precision handling made it a terrifying ground attacker. They blew up bridges, strafed convoys, and destroyed trains. In the hedgerow war of Normandy, the sound German tank commanders feared most, Next to the clatter of Sherman tank tracks was the scream of a Merlin engine in a dive. As the Allies broke out of Normandy, the war turned into fluid slaughter. In August 1944, the German Seventh Army was trapped in the Falaise pocket. It became a shooting gallery for the P-51s. Thousands of German trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn wagons clogged the narrow roads, trying to flee east. Mustangs circled overhead like vultures. The pilots didn't even need to aim. They simply pressed the trigger at the long columns on the road, and 6.50 caliber machine guns unleashed a metallic storm. But this was still not the stage the Mustang craved most. It yearned for air combat, for the duel of nights. That summer, a legendary pilot named George Preddy reached his zenith. He was the ace of the 352nd Fighter Group, known as the Blue-Nosed Bastards of Bodney. Preddy was a perfectionist, completely at one with his Mustang, Cripes a Mighty. On August 6, 1944, during an escort mission, Preddy put on one of the wildest solo performances of the European War. A large group of Bf-10-9s attempted to attack the bombers. Preddy spotted them. He didn't rush in blindly. Instead, utilizing the Mustang's superior energy retention, he climbed to gain an altitude advantage, then sliced into the enemy formation like a diving falcon. In the minutes that followed, Preddy demonstrated the art of deflection shooting. The P-51D was equipped with the advanced K-14 gyroscopic gun sight, a piece of black technology that automatically calculated lead angles. Preddy was as precise as a surgeon. In one continuous engagement, he was confirmed to have shot down 6 Bf-10-9s. This feat immortalized him. Preddy's final score stood at 26.83, making him the top P-51 Mustang ace of the European theater. His story proved that when a superior pilot met a superior machine, numerical disadvantage became meaningless. However, war is always full of irony. This god of air combat, invincible before the Luftwaffe, was killed on Christmas Day, 1944, by friendly ground fire. This tragic end remains a scar on the glorious history of the Mustang, a reminder of the chaos and cruelty of war. In the autumn of 1944, when few German propeller fighters remained in the sky, a new, unsettling sound appeared. It was not the thrum of a piston engine, but a roar like a giant blowtorch. The nightmare of Allied intelligence had come true. The Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, Swallow, the world's first operational jet fighter, had arrived. When P-51 pilots first encountered the Me-262, they felt a deep sense of powerlessness. It was a clash of two eras. The Me-262 had a top speed over 540 miles per hour, approx 870 kilometers per hour, fully 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. German pilots used this speed advantage to dictate engagement and disengagement at will. They slashed through bomber formations like lightning, firing 30mm cannons and R-4M rockets, then climbed away rapidly, leaving the bewildered Mustang pilots behind. "That thing goes like a scalded cat," a P-51 pilot wrote in his report. Had this happened in 1943, it might have turned the tide, but it was late 1944, and the P-51 had two advantages the Me-262 could not match: numbers and tactical wisdom. If we can't catch you in the sky, we'll kill you when you're weakest. The USAAF quickly devised a tactic against the jets known as rat catching. Mustang pilots realized that while jets were fast, they accelerated slowly and were incredibly clumsy during takeoff and landing when their engines were sluggish and speed was low. So, P-51s began to maintain constant circling blockades over the remaining German jet bases, such as Rhein and Akmer. In November 1944, Chuck Yeager, flying his P-51D Glamorous Glennis III, spotted an Me-262 preparing to land. Yeager didn't hesitate. He used his altitude advantage to dive and accelerate. Although his level flight speed couldn't match the jet, the gravitational energy of the dive gave the Mustang a burst of incredible speed. Just as the Me-262 dropped its gear and slowed for approach, Yeager's 6 guns opened up. The jet, representing the pinnacle of Nazi technology, was turned into scrap metal by a propeller plane before it ever touched the runway. This tactic spread quickly. Mustang pilots began to relish the hunt. They not only killed in the air, but frantically attacked the jet's fuel supply lines and runways. Although the German wonder weapon was technologically a generation ahead, it could not save the Third Reich from the absolute numerical superiority and brutal attrition tactics of thousands of P-51s. The Mustang, with its old-fashioned propeller, literally ground the dawn of the jet age into dust. In the spring of 1945, as the Soviet Red Army stormed Berlin, the smoke of the European war finally cleared. When military historians tallied the bill, the answer given by the P-51 Mustang was staggering. In the European theater, P-51 Mustangs claimed 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air. This number surpassed any other Allied fighter. Counting the 4,131 destroyed on the ground, the Mustang destroyed over 9,000 German planes in total. But behind these cold numbers lay a more strategic impact. It reduced the loss rate of B-17 and B-24 bombers from the unbearable levels of 1943 to something negligible. Thousands of bomber crew members made it home alive because they saw those silver wings and square tips. As the Senate War Investigating Committee, the Truman Committee, concluded in its post-war report, the Mustang was the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane of the war. Hermann Göring's prophecy had come true. The moment the Mustang appeared over Berlin, Nazi Germany had indeed lost. The P-51 didn't just win battles. It stripped Germany of an entire generation of flight capability, destroyed their industrial blood, and crushed their will to resist. The final chapter of the story did not end in the ruins of Berlin. After World War II, propeller planes were rapidly replaced by jets. The P-51 Mustang seemed destined for museums. However, the vitality of this old warhorse far exceeded imagination. In the subsequent Korean War, when first-generation jets struggled with range and loiter time for ground support, the P-51, now redesignated the F-51, was drafted back into service. Though it showed its age against the MiG-15, its rugged airframe and heavy firepower remained the infantry's most trusted guardian. To this day, at the Reno air races in Nevada, or at air shows around the world, when a V-1650 Merlin engine starts up, emitting that distinctive crackle and pop before settling into a deep, throaty roar, everyone present, from white-haired veterans to wide-eyed children, involuntarily looks up. That is not just the sound of an airplane. It is the thunder over Berlin in 1944. It is the umbrella over Normandy beaches. It is the roar of warriors like James Howard, Don Blakesley, and George Preddy. It is a perfect story of courage, technology, and industrial power combined. The P-51 Mustang, the plane the British initially rejected and the Americans ignored, eventually became, through a heart transplant, the sharpest sword that ended the war in Europe. It saved countless Allied lives and shortened the war by months. It proved that in the fight against tyranny, justice needs not only courage, but a pair of wings that can fly farther, higher, and faster. And beneath those silver wings, the sky of freedom remains eternal.